MDGs haven't reached people oppressed by their own governments around the world. They have absolutely no meaning for them. Perhaps had SDGs preceded MDGs, as suggested by academics, it might have been avoided a little bit. And then he mentioned about the disparity between countries, but there is disparity in one country itself so much. And without taking too much of time, I can say that UN field officials collude, sometimes collude with oppressive governments to deny the oppressed people any justice. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks. Please, at the front. And let's just say who we are, if you wouldn't mind, just as we also...
I'm John Burton from KPMG. I just wanted some reflections on what are the real lessons from the MDGs for the SDGs. And one issue I wanted to highlight was kind of how much stretch we should have in targets. Did we have the right stretch in the MDGs, and was it always useful to have the same benchmark for very different country contexts? So if you look at the kind of traffic light reports that were put out about Africa on the MDGs, you would conclude that development was a failure and aid was a waste of money, whereas if you compared the progress achieved in Africa in the last 15 years to any other period, it was a stunning success. So, you know, isn't that a problem on how we communicate? And also, don't we need contextually relevant stretch rather than a single target for everybody? I'll stop there. Thank you.
Good. No, very good points, all of them. Please.
Thank you. I guess my comment and my question is, it's clear that there were improvements and successes with the MDGs, but I think the MDGs were easier because they were less and they were all like in the same direction and there was no internal contradiction or trade-off. While in the SDGs, we already heard this morning that we are going to have to make decisions sometimes between development and sustainability, those debates that are harder to address and with real trade-offs behind. So my question is, how can we use lessons learned from the MDGs positively to address this? And I do fear that the SDGs, if they want to cover everything on Earth, are going to be very difficult to implement and put governments in a very difficult situation of prioritization and trade-offs. And kind of, they might get lost in trying to achieve so many things that are not easy.
Thank you. Thank you. Back there.
Marcus Manuel from the Overseas Development Institute. I wonder if we could hear from the panel some reflections on the politics and on the outcomes. I mean, first we've had this question about targets and the stretch targets. I just wonder, you know, whether you are very surprised by how much progress has been made. I mean, I think at the time lots of people thought these were ridiculously ambitious, and actually it seems to be rather pleasantly surprising that how much has been achieved. I'd be interested to know whether that's the panel's perception too. And second, the issue around politics. I mean, it was a very fierce political fight at the time, but the idea that the IMF should now be reporting on the MDGs, the fact that the US should be keen to talk about the MDGs, and these are quite profound political revolutions. I just wonder again whether you reflecting on the politics. And the final element of the politics is about the politics of the poor. It seems to me one of the things that happened was counting the poor and measuring poverty was a really radical change, and it did actually change the impact of policies and change the design. So again, those are the aspects of the politics and the outcome. I'd be interested to hear your reflections.
Thank you, Marcus. Over here, we're going to take a few more because I think it is, and we'll take some responses and try and come with another round. But here.
Anna Thomas from ActionAid. I just wanted to sort of pick up on a point made both by Gary Conville from Haiti and also by Richard Manning in different ways, I thought. How much is the lesson of the MDGs that what is actually important is affording developing countries themselves maximum autonomy in defining their own development priorities and plans?
there.
Tim Jones from Jubilee Debt Campaign. My question is, to what extent did MDG 8 help hold Western governments responsible for their responsibilities? My comment is the bit I know about that on debt, that there's a commitment to deal comprehensively with the debt problems of developing countries. It mobilised debt relief for some countries. I'm not sure how important it was that it was in the MDGs as opposed to all the other things that happened for that to take place. But now what we certainly feel is that comprehensive dealing with the problem didn't happen, in the respect that there were lots of countries excluded and some still suffering from serious debt problems, such as small island states. And it hasn't created any systemic way of dealing with debt problems in the future. So we come out of the MDGs with no significant change to the governmental framework around debt. So yeah, how much did MDG8 help, and what can we still do now to hold to account the MDGs that haven't been met, rather than just going straight onto thinking just about the SDGs?
Thank you. Anyone over on this side before I take a first round? Okay. Sorry, yes.
Liz Stewart from ODI. It's also an accountability question, and a broad one, which is, can you talk a little bit about what we've learned? What are the lessons from the MDGs in terms of accountability broadly that we can translate into the SDG process?
Great. Richard, do you want to go first?
Well, there's a lot of very good questions there. Let me start with the one that comes up twice about how you bring this down to country level, because I think it's really important. I think one of the things that was not as good as it should have been about the MDGs was that it was too much kind of made in New York, and there wasn't sufficient, as Gary said, I mean, the president of whichever country kind of wakes up and these MDGs have been agreed, rather without much consultation. I think the way of handling this is that we need, when it comes back to the point about targets, I'm in favour of the following approach, that you set goals which everybody agrees. The targets, in my opinion, should normally be set by the countries concerned, and I think that might often happen on a regional basis. I can well imagine the Caribbean setting itself targets, or West Africa setting itself targets, or whatever. I mean, because people do look at their neighbours, and countries are a bit more homogeneous. But that should be a matter for autonomous decision by countries who are interested in doing that. But the international community should set certain minimum standards that everybody should meet. I think that's the way to do it, because we do need to get much more buy-in from the countries concerned. That's what's important about this is not so much the effect this has on donors, it's the effect of what it has on the use of domestic resources. And for that, you've got to have the developing country buy-in, and the MDGs weren't probably constructive for that. It doesn't, I mean, taking the first point that was made, none of this solves the problem of what happens in the political dynamics within countries. Countries are responsible for their own internal political dynamics. All the international community can do is set up a framework. And the other thing that's very important points you made this morning is data, as Marcus says. I think the MDG's one big success was that it forced a much bigger investment in data. We know much more than we did. I mean, in the early years of this century, what we actually knew about what was happening on the ground was extraordinarily small. There were very few data points. Most of the numbers were made up, extrapolated, and the rest of it. I do believe that after 15 years of this, we've now got something which is significantly more robust. It's not very good, but it's a lot better than it was. So I think that part of the answer is that at least if you know what the situation is, then it's easier for local advocates to campaign around it. You know, I was told by somebody in Bolivia that the MDGs, one of the values in Bolivia in his case, was that different provinces of Bolivia were saying, well, why is my maternal mortality much higher than yours? And this is the kind of thing that's going to transform societies, when people start saying, why should we be so much worse off than they are? So that, I think, is constructive. There is an unfinished agenda, yes, undoubtedly, and we need to ensure that the SDGs don't lose unfinished agendas. I don't think MDG 8 was at all effective, and I'm sure that the debt results were not affected at all by the fact that it was MDG 8. The debt results were, thanks to Jubilee 2000 and others, were pretty well agreed. And the lack of systemic change, I think you've got to think. It comes back to Mark's very proper point about when you've got political contestation, the one thing you may be able to agree about is outcomes, but not how you get there. Now, in order to get there, things need to change. And a very important part of this, we've had references in the first session, is that various international norms, standards and systems do need to change if we're going to have sustainable progress. I mean, look at the tax issues as a very good example of that. I don't think you're going to get, in an SDG kind of context, you're not going to get governments taking decisions they're unwilling to take, say, in the Doha round or at the IMF and so on. It's not going to happen. So you've got to understand that these outcome frameworks are what they are. They're not a magic bullet. They're a thing that gives a set of incentives and measures across the world that people can then use. So we shouldn't try and oversell it in that sense. That's probably enough from me.
Let's go.
Maybe very briefly, I think one important change that we're seeing with the post-2015 agenda is that it will no longer be categorized as a framework for low-income countries. A lot of these goals and targets will actually be relevant to middle-income and to a certain extent even to higher-income countries. And this is a major shift. Now, beyond the goals and targets themselves, because I always try to avoid the discussion, was this the right target or was this the right goal? I'm sure it will vary depending on the expert you talk to. But what was impressive is that you've had a framework, a normative framework that sovereign governments stayed committed to for 15 years. And the question for me is, how do we go to a next issue of the framework that will keep these governments committed for another 15 years? How do we create the right incentives? I believe that one of the things that kept a lot of the low-income countries involved in the MDGs is that because there was the sentiment that it came with funding. You wouldn't get funding if your PRS was not clearly aligned with the MDGs. You wouldn't get bilateral aid. So a big chunk of the loyalty to the framework, in my view, besides the fact that, of course, it made sense from a development perspective, was that the fact that it was quite. Now we're going into a framework where the sources of funding will be quite diverse. How do you continue to create incentives from countries with different needs to continue to stay aligned with this new framework? That's the challenge. And that's where I think we need to think very carefully so that this doesn't die out 2 years after we approve it. And that's really the challenge I would put. You know, politics, it was quite incredible. I went into office 2 years after the Haitian earthquake, and I had about 850,000 people in camps. Despite the fact that I was coming from UNDP and I had helped do maybe a dozen PRSs, let me be honest and tell you that the MDGs was not the first thing on my agenda in October 2012. Cholera was, 850,000 people in camps were. But yet, you know, one of the things that kept me from reallocating the bulk of our resources to what I thought was, first of all, socially an emergency, but also politically correct. Because a politician knows you don't want to have 150,000 angry people. It just doesn't work out for you in the long run. But one of the things that actually kept us focused and balanced was the fact that we had this commitment to the framework. So please do keep that in mind as we continue these discussions.
Thank you, Jerry.
So 3 small points. I mean, in terms of kind of expansion of the SDG set of goals, I mean, I'm not probably the best person to talk about them, but I think in some of them actually are, so to speak, a follow-up to what has been achieved nowadays. I mean, thinking about the target on secondary education is kind of just a pressure from the big achievements that we had in universal primary education. Of course, if we kind of move back to the kind of issues around financing, I mean, secondary education is far more expensive than primary education in terms of kind of infrastructure. And at the same time, we also have a different impacts across the different income quantiles. Technically, richer kind of segments of the population do access that type of education. So these are a few questions, I mean, for the next couple of days. In terms of politics, Marcus, totally agree with you, but I would like to stress another kind of important point. I mean, the Monterey conference happened 18 months after the MDGs were set. I mean, this time around, it's happening couple of months before the SDGs will be set. This is a kind of a daunting process, but also a great opportunity to bring all those that can finance the SDGs at the table and be part of the kind of broader framework. My kind of final point, I cannot avoid that, is around the MDG 8 and that. I mean, I agree with Richard and other people in the room will have similar opinion. I mean, the kind of achievements in terms of that relief has to do with global campaigns. But also I think that the other set of MDGs, I'm talking about the education, health ones, also help gain momentum around the debt relief initiatives, because they were justifying essentially kind of freeing up resources, public finance for these goals. I mean, we're talking about, and Jesse kind of alluded to that in the first session, I mean, we're really talking about different kind of financing options, but also they have very different impacts on that sustainability. And we have seen there are some countries in Sub-Saharan Africa that have accessing international sovereign bonds, mentioned also by Kapil earlier on, at very kind of expensive rates to finance infrastructure. So I think the kind of big achievements a few months ago around the kind of sovereign that workout mechanism is quite a good kind of direction, but I really wish a more kind of firm commitment towards in the SDGs as well. And I'll stop here.
Thanks. I'm just going to make a couple of comments on the politics, because I think it is an interesting context to see it through. I mean, yes, these were written in New York, but A, they were borrowed from the global summits, so in that sense did have a broader accumulated legitimacy over the 90s. Second, they were preceded by the Millennium Declaration, which was an extraordinary event in the General Assembly of 2000, at the time the largest collection of world leaders ever, and a Millennium Declaration that had been written by Kofi Annan and those of us on his staff. And we now remember the bit that became the MDGs, but it said extraordinary things about democracy and human rights and international collaboration. It was a high watermark which has not been reached since, because I remember Chinese delegates looking at their shoes as they chose not to oppose the reference to democracy and human rights. And so it did represent this sort of end of the Clinton era moment of global optimism. But it meant that when the MDGs were the kind of follow-up out of it on the development side, it's a little too simple to say that they didn't have some legitimacy. There was buy-in at the heads of government level to some real extent, but selective buy-in. I think I'm correct in saying that it was not until the Monterey Conference in 2002 that President Bush uttered the words MDGs, because his ambassador had told him it was an invitation to international socialism, that the MDGs, because of the reference to 0.7, reflected an effort to create a global governance of and a sense of global reparation payment for poverty. And so there was a huge fight, and in fact it was Colin Powell, God bless him, who, as I recall, actually persuaded the president to utter this term. And great despair amongst the conservatives around him that he'd gone down this path. So it wasn't just, and by that point, while we actually did toy with putting democracy and human rights into the goals, just as we did toy with a much stronger reference to reproductive health, and the pushback from non-American other groups of nations around each of those issues had meant that we recognized that the consensus that seemed important was going to be lost if we got there. But just one point, just a simple biographical observation. Before I spent the second half of my career in development, I'd spent the first half in political consulting, working in developing countries to help progressive candidates get elected president of their countries. And for me, the MDGs were the ultimate political expression of development, because my ambition at that time, by keeping it to 8 goals, was that every poor person everywhere was going to have a little card in the back of their pocket with the 8 goals, and we're going to challenge their mayors and their politicians, particularly come election time, to how have you done. And so Richard's point about Bolivia, which was replicated in Vietnam, in Brazil, all over the place, where it didn't even just become, as it was in Africa, how are we doing compared to our next door country, but how are we doing compared to the next door province was for me an effort to build a great kind of grassroots accountability for development outcomes. Now, I am the first to acknowledge that we, fell well short of that ambition. But, again, you do have to, as you look forward to these next goals, recognize, the point Gary and others have made, powerful and important and correctly sort of moving the argument forward as they are in many regards. Most people wouldn't have a big enough pocket to carry a card with the new goals on them, let alone an ability to have the straightforward political narrative about outcomes that was intended for these 8 goals. Let's have another round. Simon at the back, microphone. I know we can hear you, but the idea is that other people can too.
Sitting at the back so that I can have access to a plug and tweet during the meeting, and I thought you might like to know that I retweeted Richard's point that no developing country has succeeded unless it's learned to say no to donors, and it's become probably my most retweeted tweet ever, and has already gone to something close to 100,000 people around the world. So expect comeback. I'm probably one of many in this room who spent most of their careers writing papers about the MDGs, and I dine out on my row with Claire Short about the MDGs. When they came out, there were very many good reasons to be quite sceptical about a very target-driven, arithmetic approach to the issue of delivering development. But I just want to address it. But Claire Short was right and I was wrong, and I've said this many times in public, that it was about politics and not about economics. And it was precisely because it gave momentum to raising aid and to focusing on poverty reduction that they were valuable. But this question of what lessons did the MDG era yield for development finance? I would say there are 2 or 3 rather bad lessons, actually. The first is far too great a concentration on very specific measurable indicators. The second was an emphasis as a result on project finance rather than budget support and program finance. And the third was an inability to kind of be really flexible in delivering innovative and changed programs. And those problems permeated the whole of the development industry, and including particularly the philanthropics, who became absolute users of the MDG framework to deliver vaccinations and not health system development, as Gary said earlier. So I think if we're thinking about the success, the lessons of the MDGs for the future, number one, absolutely having a framework is valuable politically if it can be kept to 8 and not, this huge number of goals and targets we currently have. Very difficult politically, but we need to do that. Secondly, we need to make sure that we don't lose country ownership and budget support in the context of delivering the MDGs. Thirdly, we absolutely need to embed an understanding of complexity and process planning and iteration and all those other terms we use in development in delivering these things. And fourth, actually something I didn't say earlier but should have done, I think that we were led away from global public goods towards national programs, and actually the main future of aid is around global public goods, not national development. So I think there are some really dangerous lessons in the success of the MDGs that we can, if we are careful, act against now before we adopt the new goals.
Thank you, Simon. Others? Yes, Alistair over here.
Thank you, Alistair McKechnie, ODI. I mean, looking at the MDGs, one area where I think there was a conspicuous lack of success was for fragile states. And that raises a number of issues about how relevant were the MDGs for the problems of fragile states, since they didn't really look at things like personal security, dignity, and these kinds of issues. And the second issue is on timeframes. And one of my observations is that on the donor countries have got very short-term objectives, whereas countries they're trying to help tend to be more patient. And then coupling that with the World Development Report 2011 on fragility, conflict, and development, which shows how long it takes to build the minimum institutions, which is 20 to 40 years. So in looking at the MDGs, were they too short-term, and were they really measuring the right things relevant to countries at risk of violent conflict? Thank you.
Thanks. And I think just at the front.
Thank you. This is a question for Annalisa a bit more. I was very struck by what you were saying around user fees and the sort of abolition of user fees, and actually progress being associated with the shift of financing to governments and to donors. And this relates a little bit to the debate we had this morning. Some people were saying, you know, it's not about public versus private. But if you look actually in the water sector, for example, I'm not a water sector specialist, but they talk about this 3 Ts, that everything has to be financed by either taxes, transfers, or tariffs, which is essentially donors, households, or individuals. If you are then talking about bringing more private sector funding into these areas, that money needs to be repaid. You know, it's either by households, or it's by governments, or it's by donors. We can't, you know, this is why I keep saying we need to get away from sort of thinking all of this money is equal. And so I guess my question is, if we are talking about more private sector money coming in, who is actually going to meet those 3 Ts? And if we are talking about shifting more of the burden onto households, which we may not be, but we could be, does that risk reversing some of those gains? So it's a rather long-winded question, but I think it's quite an important one in terms of the earlier conversation.
Paddy.
Paddy Carter from ODI. I'd like to ask about the shift in emphasis away from what you've called the welfarist approach back towards growth. We've heard a lot this morning about leveraging private investment, but of course the other way in which we might hope to catalyse the private sector is to change the environment in which investment takes place, the quality of institutions and so forth. So I'd like to ask the panel about the evidence from the MDG era about whether external actors have any ability to have a positive impact on the environment in which investment takes place.
Just over here. And then I'm going to add a couple of questions from the online questions after this.
Oliver Morris, the University of Nottingham, just to get somebody other than ODI. Now that Simon has tweeted it to so many people, I think it's worth saying that Richard's comment doesn't meet the test that Ed set at the start of the session, which was the evidence test. Because actually, if you look at successful cases, you won't find that they said no to donors. So I would correct the tweet and say that the successful cases are those that didn't have to say no to donors, because they and the donors had an agreed agenda, and they had reached a kind of a relationship of trust where they were both aiming in the same direction. And I think you'll find that that is the case for most of the countries that have been successful in terms of economic growth and probably in terms of the MDGs.
Very interesting. All right, look, a couple of points online. An online debate has developed while we've been talking about rural livelihoods and what are the SDGs going to do to tackle them, which has then prompted a further thing about shouldn't we have improving rural infrastructure in the SDG framework because the MDGs didn't adequately tackle access issues. So, you know, it's this classic thing. Once you get one goal, then a lot of targets and elaborations follow. And the other just online theme that has come up properly, of course, inevitably, is addressing corruption and the big problem that poses to achieving development goals. We've got one more. A microphone less. Sorry, I misled you. And then we'll come back to the panel after this.
Thank you. One of the great surprises, I guess, historically is, of course, that the most difficult MDG 1 was actually reached. I think the important conversation that we are too seldom having now, I think, if we accept that that leaving no one behind, that eradicating absolute poverty is what we should aim at for 20. How much of that can be reached with what instrument? Sort of, how much of the residual poverty, if we can use that phrase, can we actually deal with through the sort of standard historical meals of economic transformation and inclusive growth, and how much of it is of a different character that will require different type of approaches that and will not be solved through private sector investment, through economic growth, and so. And I feel that's if you could reflect a bit on the basis of the experience on what guidance we can get for the relative importance of the different ways in which we need to address the remaining part of the poverty agenda.
Thank you. All right, plenty there. Let's start the other end this time, Gary.
You know, these are all very, very good points and comments. In 2010, I took a look at Zambia and Malawi. Zambia had done extremely well with the education goal and somehow was lacking with the under 5 mortality. Malawi, on the contrary, had done extremely well with the under 5 mortality and was struggling with the education goal. And I asked myself, what was happening there? And when we looked carefully, we found that one key ingredient was that exactly what you mentioned. In the case of Malawi, the government was able to come together with key stakeholders. All the elements were there: financing, policy, strategic relationships, and that led to the transformations. And that's influenced my view quite a bit on when things work and when they don't work. Oddly enough, without a growth goal, Africa has done quite well in terms of growth. So I'm not sure if we had had a growth goal in the MDGs, it would have made much difference. Every government that comes into power gives itself as one main objective, its growth. There's no doubt about that. But what the MDGs did was to help us focus on areas that wouldn't have been prioritized necessarily otherwise. So when we look at how we move forward on the remaining parts of this, first, I think it's going to be extremely country-specific. I don't think there's any way to generalize, and it's going to depend on the capacity of the different stakeholders to sit together and assess and address this. But what is a certainty for me is that if we don't keep our eyes on the ball, we may lose a lot of this.
Do you want to go, Annalisa?
Yeah, just a couple of points. I mean, totally agree with Simon around the agenda of ownership. I just wanted to kind of stress that, of course, when I was kind of mentioning financing is associated with progress, there are far more kind of factors contributing to progress. And one of the kind of key findings from the first phase of the Development Progress Project was actually the role of leadership. I mean, progress did take place because there was kind of political will, and this was the case, for instance, in Kenya, that we looked more closely about kind of expanding access to primary and secondary education. This was a political decision, and finance followed that. On the kind of point around successful countries able to say no to donors, I have to say that I would like to add really my kind of two-penny worth comment to this. I think we need to kind of think what are the characteristics for these countries to say no to donors. These are case of Rwanda, I'm thinking about Ethiopia, countries that actually showed results or are potentially kind of quite strategic from a geopolitical point of view. In terms of Romilly's question, I mean, around the role of the private sector, as I said, I mean, there were 3 main financiers. I mean, there's presence of the private sector. I mean, of course, we always talk about financing like for all the sectors. Of course, we need, when we start thinking about the role of the public and private sector, we need to kind of start unpacking. I mean, I think also the kind of 8 dimensions of well-being can be quite useful. I mean, the role of the private sector in security, or at least for the transition, is kind of relatively minimal. But when we kind of looked and still kind of bring up kind of experiences from this wealth of case studies, I mean, there was the role of the private sector, for instance, in expanding education in Mongolia, also in the case of Kenya, but there was actually quite a high contribution of the public sector in terms of capitation grants. So the government essentially was covering the variable cost. So again, maybe you can have the private sector, but there's generally a kind of backup of financing resources. And there's a second point, which is I really kind of alluded to, is around reaching the most vulnerable. I mean, is thinking about kind of expanding electrification grid to the most kind of remote areas. The kind of incentives are, of course, for the public sector and not necessarily for the private sector to do so, or reach in terms of kind of, I'm thinking about kind of expansion of low-cost private schools in Kenya. They're not present, as far as I know, in the northeast, where you have the nomadic community. So there's a kind of role for the government to kind of reach the most vulnerable. And I'll stop here.
Richard.
Simon raised some very interesting points, and I go halfway with him about the danger that targets distort behaviour in unhelpful ways, or can do so. I think I would. It's quite interesting actually to see that Bill Gates, one of your philanthropy people, having set up Gavi and the rest of it, is now in his latest letter saying we've got to understand systems better. And, you know, he's taking time to get there, but I think there's a recognition that you can't do it all by vertical means. And a very nice report was written by the World Bank for the Accra High-Level Forum in 2008, in which it really showed, I think, that vertical funds were very effective in countries that weren't particularly aid-dependent. They got real focus on something and they worked within a context. When you're a highly aid-dependent country, then the vertical fund can skew things too much, and you need to have you also need the kind of financing that Simon's talked about to ensure that the systems can be built. And I think if we've learned anything in the Ebola crisis, I mean, you can see what the problems are when you don't do that. I thought a very good question is what's the right time frame for this sort of target setting? The MDGs was really extraordinary because, in fact, we were setting targets on a base of 1990 in the year 2001 for 2015. I mean, how crazy is that? On the other hand, I think that in effect, we were pretty much setting 15-year targets, and 15 years seems to have been quite a smart judgment by accident. I quite agree, donors are far too short-term. Setting 3 or 4 year targets is a waste of space. Setting 50-year targets is a waste of space because that's too long-term for everybody. I think, pragmatically, I think 2030 is a very reasonable target for us setting ourselves. Fragile states, you're right, and of course comes back a little bit to the difficulty of getting into these complex institutional matters that don't lend themselves very much to outcome targeting. And this is, again, you know, we have to think that the MDGs is not an instrument to sort of solve all the problems of the world, neither will the SDGs. It's an instrument, like all these things, as I've said before, they're good servants and bad masters. And Simon, you can tweet that as well if you like. You know, we have not to be slaves to the frameworks we set up, and clearly fragile states. The story I always tell is that when the British decided to move over to resource accounting, a new way of doing government accounting, I think it took 7 years to introduce it, and that's a reasonably competent government with high-level people working on it. But the donors, you know, expect Rwanda to do something in 6 months, which is completely ridiculous. And I fully agree with what you say about timescales. How to get to the ultra-poor, Mark, your question. I mean, this remains extremely difficult. There's a very interesting DFID program in Bangladesh trying to look at the ultra-poor and how to help them. And, of course, some people will be helped through the growth of the economy, through jobs, which is ultimately the way people earn their living. And over time, with urbanisation and everything else, this is changing the dynamics in these countries. But at the same time, I think experience around the world shows that some kind of safety net needs to be put in place. And it's been very interesting to see what's happened in cash transfers over the last 5-10 years. Nothing specifically to do with the MDGs, but learning from good experience in Latin America in this case to see what you can do. And I think a mix of tools is certainly going to be necessary. I'm very positive about the question you had about rural infrastructure. I was pretty shocked, actually, in Michael Anderson's excellent high-level panel report that there's not any suggestion of any kind of target for transportation. To my mind, communications is a very important part of changing anything. I mean, the great success of mobile phones has been very transformative, as everybody knows. But at the same time, road transportation, access to markets, all the rest of it, this is really important for people in the backwoods, in rural areas and the rest of it. To cut transport costs is what drove the British Industrial Revolution, canals, railways and the rest of it. Cutting transport costs is very valuable in all areas, and I hope that will be reflected somewhere. The very interesting point about tariffs and who pays for these services. I mean, listen to what Kevin was saying. There's trillions of money in pension funds that, and there's all these demands. Your pension will not be safe unless somebody's paying the tariff at the other end. These two things have to happen together. So the question is, with smart planning, can we not? At the moment in Africa, for example, people are spending a fortune on electricity by generating themselves with very inefficient diesel sets or by having everything cut off and the rest of it. There must be ways of getting power to many more people through systems where people actually have to pay rather than steal power. You should be very tough on that kind of thing. where tariffs are, if necessary, subsidised to make them affordable to certain classes of people. You need smart ways of doing that. But you've got to have a predictable stream of payments if you're going to engage pension funds or anybody else in actually investing in them. And finally, on the saying no to donors thing, I shouldn't make too much of this, but in the late 1980s, I was responsible for British aid to Asia. And I used to go quite frequently to both Delhi and Kathmandu. In Delhi, the Indian government approach was, we have a plan, donors have got to follow this plan, and we want this money from you, Britain, by the 31st of March, and how are we going to sit down and do it? And we might have ideas for that. The Indian government had its own ideas, and if push came to shove, it's the Indian government's ideas that would rule. And it was a tough discussion. And I would say one thing: we were giving India very large amounts of money by our standards. I was never at any point thanked for anything I did. When I went to Kathmandu, the atmosphere was totally different. We were thanked all the time. Very nice people to deal with. Attitude was, you're providing grant aid, go and do something useful in community forestry and Gurkha resettlement or whatever it happened to be. And, which of these two countries is going to make more progress? I don't think the Nepalese ever objected to anything we wanted to do, and they said the same to other donors. And my observation in Nepal at the time, it may not be true now, but at the time was that Nepal was a classic case of a country where aid was less than the sum of its parts. And that's what I'm trying to get at with this. I mean, you've got to have a country which knows what it wants to do, is prepared to stand up for that. And, donors aren't very bright people. They're people like me, generalists of all sorts who swan in and don't know the country very well, don't know how the country works, and have their own ideas which are being driven by their own domestic politics. We're not right all the time. We're wrong most of the time. So it's really important that countries are sufficiently assertive. And this is why of all the Paris Declaration targets, the most important are around ownership and mutual accountability. It has to be a grown-up relationship between people on both sides in which everybody's sufficiently assertive and takes responsibility for their own actions under that. That's what I'm trying to get at.
Thanks. I'm going to just offer two quick observations on the poverty point. I want to come back to the KPMG thing about countries, because I think we didn't quite adequately address that. I mean, the first thing to say about that last mile poverty challenge of the next period of the SDGs is, some work that's been done associated with ODI by Andrew Rogerson and others, which, argues that the location of the poor is not anymore going to be big lumpen poor components of large countries. It's not going to be so much poor in Brazil, India, or let alone China. That the poor over the 15 years going forward will increasingly be in fragile, weak states across an arc of West Africa through the Middle East, countries like Yemen, through to South Asia. Now, you can debate whether this is completely correct or not, but I think it does, Alistair, go to the point that, fragility of government institutions is going to be a much bigger driver of fighting poverty or impediment to fighting poverty than has been the case in the last 15 years. And that leads me to the point that, you just cannot settle the kinds of country strategies to tackle it globally. They have to be settled nationally. And some of us were talking in the coffee break about how, in Europe, nobody agrees what the right economic policy is, whether to prioritize, investment in decentralizing to cities away from the capital, or whether to put more money into education or into infrastructure, because that is politics. National choices need to be made within a finite resource envelope. And the dangerous detachment of the SDGs from that is this somehow assumption that there's some sort of global cost plan that can be written with all of these objectives. And I do think we are actually playing with fire, because I think we could quite well, when there's a seminar on lessons from the SDGs in 15 years' time, it might have a heading, Simon, get ready to tweet, the law of how best intentions can really screw you up. Because, it seems to me that what you've got to do still is keep a relatively straightforward global framework of outcomes that, yes, adds in something about transparency and governance and rule of law, and yes, has something on access, not just physical transport, but also internet access, cell phone, the rest of it. I mean, there are some big goals that we can sensibly add to what we have. But the actual decision about targets and what your current baseline is and what you should hope to achieve in the next 15 years has got to be done at the country and sometimes at the sub-regional level, because not all of it are going to be country decisions when it comes to trade and investment and infrastructure even, and some stuff like that. But, you know, we really have gone a little mad with this process. And so, you know, and no issue points it up more than that last mile poverty issue. You know, I mean, I have some very serious discussions in countries like China and Rwanda about last mile poverty. It troubles me that it always seems to be the least democratic ones which have, you know, the best focus on this often. But, you know, you can go to some other countries and it's not a serious engagement. They're trivializing it and telling you what they think a donor wants to hear. But you're never going to solve that through an intergovernmental discussion in New York. You're going to solve it by setting a national framework, and then all sides, donors, investors, governments, but above all citizens, holding people to account for that national framework of implementation of a set of straightforward global goal outcomes. And as I say, I think the process sadly has completely, you know, it's lost its anchors in that sense.
Thank you. Can I please add something? Because we spoke about the report. I was advisor to President Sirleaf as co-chair of the panel. And imagine what it's like working on a panel with 27 people that are used to having the last word. Now, our greatest fear was that we would end up with a document that would actually reflect the lowest common denominator instead of the highest level of ambition. I feel that the panel came out with a strong document that basically identifies some of the key areas that are essential for our world to progress in a humane manner. It does not, and it will not, and it can't include all the different elements, not because they're less important. I don't think so. I remember we received great pressure to make sure that we include animal rights as a key goal. Now, I agree with that, I mean, to a certain extent, but then we started getting into really, really heavy discussions, and we had to make cuts. And my sense is in the next few months, these are the type of discussions that are going to go forward. I just hope that at the end of the day, everybody keeps in mind that what we want to come up with is a framework like the MDGs, and not in terms of targets and goals, but that will have lasting capacity, that will keep people focused and engaged for the next 15 years like the MDGs does. And attempting to do too much right now is probably the worst thing we can do.
Yeah. No, and I think, Gary, and you know this, I mean, all of us sort of recognize that that report was, in a sense, the high point of this process, because it was a sensible discussion. It's since then, it's all that's been added to it as the sort of Christmas tree has got bigger and bigger with more and more things hung on it. And, you know, the political process, you know, sadly got lost. I mean, there's quite funny stories around Whitehall of, you know, David Cameron thought he'd been asked to write the sort of new SDG manifesto for the next 15 years. Now, anyone who's not a Brit knows that the likelihood that a British Prime Minister is going to get to do that in the 21st century is, you know, pretty implausible. But nevertheless, I think he was strutting his stuff. He thought he'd been given this great task. And what he didn't realise, and I don't think anybody in Whitehall dared tell him, even the admirable Michael Anderson, who is, you know, a sufficiently good operator that he didn't want the modern equivalent of beheading. And, you know, I just don't think that Cameron, and maybe not even Ellen, sort of realised that there was going to be another 18 months of sort of iterative political confusion around this, and a process that's going on now. And, you know, and there are lots of people in the process now, the co-chairs, very good ambassadors, Kenya, and I forget who the other one is, Norway maybe, or something, I forget, Ireland. And, you know, people inside the Secretariat who are desperately trying to hold this thing onto the ground and not let it just completely, you know, float away. But, you know, they're late. You've now got, what is it, 17 goals, 86, right, something, yeah. And, you know, the latest thing is, well, maybe the 17 goals can be 6 imperatives, which is a kind of quite sneaky Secretariat idea. rather pleased when I heard they were up to that, sort of get the last word on the governments. But, somehow, some way, someone's got to pull this back to something that ordinary folk can, remember what they are and the way we can the MDGs. Please. We need the mic. No, over there.
Thank you. Gideon Rabinovitz, also from ODI. Sorry. I have to apologise that I'm from ODI. Can I ask, what are the risks and opportunities that the Financing for Development conference comes before the finalisation of the SDGs? It sounds like, listening to Gary Keneal's presentation, that there is potentially a risk that what happened with the MDGs was countries signed up for something ambitious and then said, well, are you guys going to help us deliver this? Are you going to reward us? Are you going to match our ambitions in what we've signed up to? Potentially the fact that this is happening the other way around, leads me to think that maybe if countries aren't even sure if donors aren't even, if the international community isn't sure what countries are going to sign up to, does that play into the weakened ambitions around what resources they will pledge towards this agenda?
I think someone's going to tell us we haven't answered her question.
Conflict insensitive aid has been exacerbating conflicts in some of the countries, and donors are responsible for that, helping oppressive governments. And Sri Lanka is a very good example for that one. And now, how do you conquer with the reports, books by Moyo, Dambisi Moyo or Professor Angus Deaton have been writing, stop this aid except for technological or medical urgent aid. Let them develop. Corruption is rife there, nepotism, political patronage. So will you stop that? So will you consider that? That means we have to consider the whole system. The poverty is caused by many factors. So we have to please think of the bigger system and act.
Thank you. Anyone else? We're moving towards lunchtime, so any other last? Sorry.
Sorry, Romilly Greenhill, also from ODI. Just a final follow-up really to Alistair's point on the whole fragile states agenda, because, obviously there are the peace and state building goals. What I'm not quite clear on is, in fragile states context, are those sort of prior goals to the other SDGs? Or are they additional goals? What's the sequencing? And as several people have noted, if we are talking about poverty being increasingly concentrated in fragile states, what does that really mean for the SDG agenda?
Thanks. Okay. Richard, do you want to?
I think I'll pass on the FFD thing. The business of fragile states, conflict insensitive aid, and so on is of course really important. I mean, the future of countries is very much determined by the way in which governments operate, and particularly in countries where, as in the case of Sri Lanka, you've got majority, minority communities and the rest of it. These can be very poisonous. I mean, Francis Stewart has written very eloquently around the problems of horizontal inequality and all the rest of it. And I don't think the answer to that is to abandon the international aid effort, but the answer is to be always very careful about how donors who are outside forces here operate in a conflict-prone environment, of which there are, of course, many. And as Romilly says, we're going to have to increasingly do a better job in these countries if things are going to work. But donors have to be quite humble here. There's a limit to what one can do. Countries will do what they will do at the end of the day, but donors have to be very careful in operating in those environments that they don't inadvertently exacerbate situations and all the rest of it. And it comes back a little bit to the inquiry from outside about corruption and how we deal with that. And corruption is a very toxic issue for aid donors. Again, it's not something where you can reach for instantaneous solutions. So I think that what I come down to is that we have to always to be practical about the speed at which things are going to move, And as we operate in these more trickier environments, there has to be much more understanding in development agencies about how countries really work. I think donors have underinvested in understanding history, culture, and all the rest of it. I would definitely encourage in all donor agencies much more thinking about the institutions you're dealing with, the political economy of the place you're dealing with, the cultural history of that country, and operate within context rather than import ready-made solutions. I think you're quite right, Mark. I think it has to be very country-specific and done that way. Thank you.
Gideon, your question around timing of the FFD vis-a-vis setting the SDGs. I mean, I remember a couple of years ago when with Romilly we started looking into how to finance the SDGs. Actually, it was slightly premature at that time. It was like, as we've been told, buying a ticket for an unknown destination. So, but it was already quite a good exercise to have an idea of what the resources were at stake. I mean, I see dangers also to have the conference later on. I'm really glad, actually, I advocated for the conference to take, the FFD conference to take place before the SDGs, because we really need to kind of have very different actors compared to Monterey on board. I'm talking about philanthropic organizations, the more so the private sector, where their engagement in other fora is still quite difficult to make happen. So that's the kind of point. And on the other hand, we need to be pragmatic. I mean, the report by the Secretary General of the UN will be released later this month, early December. So at least there will be something quite concrete for discussion. And the FFD process, as we probably speak, are starting the kind of prep work in New York. So these are going to be two processes. I mean, the kind of challenges in this particular case, as it was for the Open Working Group and for the Intergovernmental Committee of Experts on Sustainable Development Financing, is for the two processes to talk to each other towards July.
Okay. Very quickly, you know, I come from a fragile state, Haiti, and I can tell you the worst thing we could do is to say that we would have two sets of targets and goals, and that Haitians should aspire to universal education, universal health care. I think through the New Deal, which is, I think, a very interesting document, the difference is really how we would engage with fragile states, with the commitment to building capacity and increasing, you know, their capacity to actually respond and address some of the key social issues. But I think, for me anyway, as a Haitian, it would be a wrong approach for the global community to say that, but certainly the way we would engage in Haiti would certainly have to defer to the way you would engage with Tanzania or any other countries, because I do have capacity constraints. I think that would be basically how I had approached it.
Great. Well, look, thank you all. I mean, I think this has been very useful. I'm not sure we've answered precisely the questions posed to us, but I think this question of how you bring the private sector in, there's been some stuff from over the internet while we've been talking about that. How do you get the private sector at Addis? Who represents the private sector? The private sector is never really going to commit to a number, as I'm sure your work has shown, Annalisa, are ahead of, you know, wanting to see bankable projects and wanting to see what, you know, what its returns are. But, you know, I think what this panel is reconfirming is that, you know, the pendulum-like swings that characterize development, which is precisely because of its political precariousness, is too often a faddish, fashion-driven business. That the need to be consistent to make sure the business of the MDGs, the unfinished business of the MDGs, is not left unfinished. Secondly, that the ODA, which has been such a critical component of securing MDG advance, is not left is not neglected in this next round, and that nor is the focus on poverty particularly. But, you know, I think what comes through it all is that those partners, the role of domestic resources, as we've heard all morning, and the potential role of international capital, if it can be steered towards some of the harder to reach bits of SDG success, are key components. We're finishing a minute early. Normally a conference chair says, well, that's great because all the delegates will have more time to network over lunch. But it's all ODIers talking to ODIers, it seems. Maybe a dull lunch. Anyway, thank you all very much.
Thank you.